I'm a firm believer in having objective grading criteria that's easy for everyone to understand. There are subjective components to music and there are objective components to music. And I always use the objective components to assess my students. If you just say, hey, I gave this student a higher grade because I liked what they played better, and this student, I didn't like it as much, so gave them a B, that's not going to hold up. You have to have some objective qualities and relevant objective qualities too. If you just say, my objective scale is going to be based on the darkness of the stain on your instrument. The darker the stain, the higher grade you're going to get, and the lighter it is, well, tough luck. That's not really something the students can control in that moment. So you're going to have to have performance-based, relevant, objective criteria. I'm a firm believer in rubrics. I think rubrics are a great way to go because it's easy to explain to people why a student got this grade. There are domains set up, there are criteria for each score, you add it up, and that's the score they get. That way, when you have a parent that says, hey, why did my student get this grade on this assessment, you can just walk them through the rubric and say, look, they did this, they did this, they did this. Great. Same thing with an administrator. Hey, why did this student get this score? Because we had a parent complain. You walk them through the rubric, and it's very easy for them to understand. You want to make it very clear so even if they're non-music people, they can kind of walk through the rubric with you, and you can just kind of show them and maybe listen to the recording or watch their video that they submitted or have some kind of record of what they did and say, look, this is the way it went and this is how I scored it. For your beginning orchestra, you're probably going to have a completely different rubric than you do for your concert orchestras, your middle school orchestras, and high school orchestras. So their rubric might be based on the quality of their bow hold. Okay? It might be based on a note reading exercise. So the criteria you use for your beginners are probably not going to be the same that I use for my high school orchestras, and they shouldn't be. And there might be some things that you use that go against your performance rubric. Maybe you're doing a supply check. Hey, do you have your supplies? Do you have whatever? And that might be its own rubric. Do you have a pencil? Do you have your folder? Do you have your material? That's part of your participation in my class. If you don't have this stuff, then you can't participate, so your participation grade's going to drop if you don't have these items. I came up with a performance rubric a while back, long before I had these gray hairs over here. And it's probably because of this rubric that I don't have even more gray hairs because it's saved me quite a few times. But the thing that I like about this rubric is that there are 10 domains, which, 100 is divisible by 10, so it makes it easier to score. So, 100 domains, 5 dimensions deep. It also has like a lower limit that's pretty much absolute zero, like in the nothing category, so that you don't end up with a negative score or something like that. If you want a copy of this, just send me an email, teachingorchestra@gmail.com, and I'll send you my rubric. You're welcome to modify it and use whatever language you want. I haven't modified this very much, if at all, since I started using it, and it works pretty well for me. But if there's something that you want to change or mix up, you're welcome to do that. It's your class. Do whatever you want. I think it's important to set your minimum low because it prevents you from having to give out negative scores, and that doesn't really fit into our grading system, at least not in the computer. Not the eSchool software that I use. They don't allow you to give negative scores, and using other assessment practices. I used to teach AP music theory for quite a few years, and I gave an exam once, and there was some students that ended up getting negative scores on this exam. And basically what happened was there was an error detection. It was like there was a line where there were some errors, and they were supposed to detect the errors, and I had up at the top see if you can detect where the parallel fifths are, and here see if you can detect where the parallel octaves or the direct octaves, whatever. And, I listed all this stuff, and they had to look at the line below and circle and show where the errors were. Now, on these students in particular, there was like, I think, 3 errors per line. Like I had I had a couple different lines, and I had, what I wanted them to find. And they ended up circling things that weren't errors, and they ended up circling like 12 things that were errors. And so it's like, well, they missed it, so I got to take 12 points off, but this was only worth 3 because there was only 3 possible errors to find. And so because of the way that I thought about this, I gave them credit for what they did and then took points away, then the grading scale got messed up, and so they ended up getting negative scores. So I had to like rethink my grading scale, and it ended up being a giant mess. And so, I rethought the way I grade things, make sure that there was a bottom and that they couldn't fall below the bottom. I think part of that becomes not being so idealistic. It's like, well, they missed it, so you got to take points off, right? Well, no, it's like instead of taking points off for them missing it, you give them points for what they got right. And that's kind of how my rubrics work is, you give them points for what they do right, and they start from the rock bottom. It could be the same thing with your supply check. Like, let's say instead of bringing a pencil to class, they bring a live animal or something, and you don't take additional points off for that, do you? No. So you give them points for what they do, and get that live animal out of your classroom. It's really important that your students understand your rubric and how you grade things. And it's important because they need to be able to set performance goals. And if they themselves can't properly evaluate how they're doing, then when they go back and listen to the things that they're submitting, they might not be up to your standards. So how do you teach your students about your grading criteria, and how do you get them to understand how the grades work in your class? What I like to do is have my students listen to things, and then I just ask them, my grading criteria goes on a score from 1 to 5, right? We have 5 fingers. And so I just say, hey, is this a 1? Is this a 2? Is this a 3? Is this a 4? We go over the language, we listen to something, like, how's the intonation on this? Is it perfect? I guess that would be a 5 in my scale. Would it be perfect? Do you hear some tuning errors? Are most of the notes in tune? Are most of the notes out of tune? Or is there no sense of tonality whatsoever? See, there's a bottom there where it's just like, yeah, there's no coherent tuning. Maybe they had their music upside down or something like that. That's where it's got to go. So you start to, do a litmus test on your class, and they can all hold up fingers and see kind of where that is. And there might be some variance, but most of them are kind of in the ballpark. And I wouldn't have them go through the whole rubric at once. Just have them go through one domain at once and say, like, how's the rhythm on this? How's the tempo? Whatever. Just go through it that way. Otherwise, it uses a lot of class time. You don't want to spend too much class time going over this, but at the same time, like, they have to be able to be critical and evaluate. And another good way to do this is to have them evaluate each other. So I like to do the peer-to-peer coaching. I like to split my students up by desks and have one student listen to the other student and evaluate based on the rubric. Like, how's their intonation? How is their articulation here? What are they doing? Show me a scale, 1 to 5. And then I have them do it again and see if that student can improve their score, get the score higher. And I think peer-to-peer coaching is super valuable. I do it every day, and I highly recommend it to you also. Might get a little trickier when you're talking to parents, okay? You teach your students about this stuff. Well, your parents aren't sitting in on your classes, so how do they know what's in tune and what's out of tune? And sometimes you're just gonna have to explain it to them. I had a parent recently, they were confused about their student's grade, and I had marked their tempo down severely because they weren't even playing close to tempo. And the parent said, well, how could this be? They have a metronome on, and they have it set to 148 beats per minute, and so how could their tempo be off? And I had to explain to them, like, well, they're not playing with the metronome. Okay, what does that mean, they're not playing with the metronome? It's like, well, let's say I'm gonna jog for 30 minutes and I set a timer for 30 minutes and then I stop jogging after 5. Does that mean that I jogged for 30 minutes just because the timer said 30 minutes? No, you have to follow the timer. And if you're not following the metronome, then you're not playing the right tempo. And the parent got it. And it's like, okay, yes, I get it. And you might have to show them some examples too. Like, here's an example of good intonation. Here's an example of not so good intonation. Like, can you hear the difference? And just about everybody can. They can hear the difference between quality and not so quality. Okay, you hear that note? It's not quite there. Okay, and eventually they'll go with you. For administrators, sometimes they're not quite clear on your grading scale. Most administrators don't have a background in music, and they have less time because they don't have as much of a dog in the fight as it would be as about what this student's grade is going to be. And so you've got to be able to explain this to them very quickly. So having a written rubric and showing what's circled and say, hey, this is what I got. I'm the music expert here. You see these degrees on my wall, and hopefully they trust you and they go with it. If not, well, they're the boss, so you got to do what the boss says. So I guess, if that becomes a recurring issue, then maybe clear up the language in your rubric or make your rubric more accessible. In the next video, I'm going to provide some commentary on how often I assess my students, on how often I grade my students, and on the rationale for why I do things a certain way. Of course, there's going to be a lot of differences in lots of different orchestra programs, and one day I would like to have some other orchestra teachers on to talk about why they do things their way. That way there's more information out there and you can find some sort of philosophy that you can match up with. But until then, you're stuck with me. So we'll see you in the next video.